I met a traveller in an antique land, who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert near them on the sand. Half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch away. You know, I never really got this poem. It's all about how this guy's achievements all just turned to dust. But they didn't turn to dust. They turned to exhibits in the British Museum.
What is all of this?
It's about the collapse of the Bronze Age.
The poem?
No, the poem's about how time consumes all things. Shelley didn't know fucking shit about the Bronze Age. The year is 1960, and 28-year-old American George Bass has just finished his service in the US Army and is looking for work. He has 2 great passions in life: archaeology and the sea. So you can imagine his excitement when an old colleague of his got in contact with him, hoping that George would join his team in excavating a shipwreck off Cape Geladonia. The wreck was pretty deep, so they needed experienced divers involved. And George had used scuba gear before, once, in a YMCA swimming pool. But to be fair, it was the 1960s and scuba diving was fairly new, so having done it before legitimately made George Bass one of the most experienced divers available. Besides, the man was named after a fish, so how bad could it really be? At the time, this was the oldest shipwreck by far to ever see the light of day again. The vessel had sunk a whopping 3,200 years ago, and it was loaded with what was obviously goods for trade: tin and copper, the essential ingredients for making bronze, the premier metal of the day, along with pottery and other goods, right next to some weighing and measuring tools. The team knew that they had obviously found a merchant vessel, evidence of an extensive trade network in the late 2nd millennium BCE. Ecstatic at the find, George rushed back to the University of Pennsylvania to get his PhD and published a paper on the shipwreck in 1967. He concluded that the ship was from Canaan and had sunk en route home from a trading mission to the Greek mainland. And this was met by instant skepticism. The academic community was not ready to accept that such long-distance trade was anything the late Bronze Age Canaanites were capable of. They largely thought the ship was Mycenaean Greek because of the location. But Fishman George stuck to his theory, and in 1972 he founded the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. But it wouldn't be until 1982 that he would get another chance to prove his idea. A Turkish sponge diver by the name of Mehmet Kakir spotted something that he described as a metal biscuit with ears, submerged about 50 meters from the shore near Bodrum in southern Turkey. Bass and the team were soon there, but there was a problem. The shipwreck that they had dealt with 20 years ago was 89 feet below the surface. Not much of a problem. But this one was at least 140 feet down, and it was on a slant. So some parts of the wreck were as deep as 170 feet, which is well below safe diving depth. So the archaeologists could only dive twice a day for 20 minutes each time, overseen by ex-Navy SEALs for safety reasons. Bass described the effect of working so deep as like having 2 martinis before starting work. On top of this, the boat was so fragile that they couldn't risk trying to haul it up in one go and having it just disintegrate. So a new type of adhesive glue had to be developed to inject into the artifacts underwater so they could harden over time and then be safely brought to the surface. The labour lasted for a full decade, with over 22,000 dives and not a single injury. To show for it, they had proof of what old Georgie had suspected all along. On board were goods from many distant lands. Weapons from Egypt, Syria and Greece, and possibly as far afield as Italy, the Balkans and Afghanistan. The ship was not a rustic or simple vessel, but a well-built one, with what was clearly a well-organised and fairly multicultural crew. The world from which it came was clearly not one of isolated kingdoms and civilizations, but extraordinarily connected. Clearly the people of this era were practicing regular enough trade that it was not unusual for someone to have possessions sourced from thousands of miles away in any direction from where they lived. Nice one, George. Rest in peace, man. So, who inhabited this interconnected world? Who were the many peoples who might have come into contact with the Uluburun wreck? Well, let's take a look at what the Eastern Mediterranean looked like in the late Bronze Age. So here is what the Near East looked like around 3.5 millennia ago. Starting in the northwest, we have the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. These are the Greeks of myth. The Achaeans of Homer's poems, Jason and his Argonauts, King Minos and his angry cow. These are Mycenaean and Minoan stories, but they aren't really recognizable as the classical Greeks that we know and love. That's all about 700 years away, as are many of the things that we associate with ancient Greece. No democracy for the Mycenaeans, for example. No, they have absolute monarchies. And no hundreds of autonomous little city-states either. No, instead, huge great swaths of land are controlled by one central government located in a palace. Think about how medieval castles worked. You have a defensible, fortified centre which controlled a large territory around it. Palatial centres popped up all over Mycenaean Greece, from Mycenae, the city from which the whole civilization gets its name, to Pylos, to Tiryns, to Medea, Athens, Thebes, etc. All of which control vastly more territory than their descendants would in the classical Greek age. By the time of the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean cities all seem to have been acting in a sort of confederation, headed by a high king, a king of kings, if you will, called a wanax, probably centered at Mycenae, which is the largest of these palatial centers. And this absolute king would have been in charge of ensuring his people got enough of the necessary resources they needed to live. Things like bronze, the metal of the day. Neither tin nor copper can be found in Greece, so instead the Mycenaeans developed a huge pottery and art industry in order to get foreign merchants involved with them so that they can continue to get these essential resources. Like many Bronze Age states, the Mycenaeans operated a command economy, something that we'll discuss in a bit more detail later, with intense micromanagement and records kept in their writing system of Linear B of everything the state produced and traded for. All of this ensured that goods and resources continued to flow through the Greek world. And then we have the people of Crete, the Minoans. There was once a time when the Minoans operated independently, but a few centuries before, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece had overrun the island. But the people there still maintained a fair bit of their culture, and they are disproportionately talked about in Egyptian and Mesopotamian writings, probably because of their island's sheer usefulness for trade. Getting to Egypt from Crete is a piece of cake. You barely even need to focus on sailing. Just kick back and let the trade winds take you where you need to go. As a result of this, the Egyptian pharaohs regularly speak of exchanging gifts, which means trade, but trade was beneath the dignity of an Egyptian pharaoh, so they call it a gift exchange, with the island of Keftu, which is what they called Crete. They also hired many Minoan and Mycenaean mercenaries to fight in their wars. To the east of the Mycenaeans, in mainland Anatolia, you get the Hittites, this vast and warlike empire which was administered by a great king in the capital of Hattusa, which was located right in the center of their territory. Now, not only is this territory clearly geographically difficult to hold on to, it's got numerous borders with other great states. To the west, there are the Mycenaeans, Egyptians to the south. To the north, you've got the Kashka people, and then to the east, there are the Mitanni and then later the Assyrians to contend with. But it was also really rich in natural resources, copper for making bronze amongst other things. And so to deal with this, the Hittites maintained a large and effective military, headed by a force of very heavy charioteers, and I mean heavy. Whilst everyone else is darting around in light chariots, shooting each other with bows and arrows, the Hittites are making fucking tanks pulled by horses, with great big spears and 3 charioteers per chariot, designed to just mow through people. These chariots came from a military class usually drawn from the noble families of the subject cities of the Hittites. Cities like Emar and Ugarit, which operated semi-independently and were on their own very wealthy as trade hubs, but owed supplication to, and therefore enjoyed the protection of, the Hittite king. Not only experts in war, the Hittites were also very, very good at peace, with over half of the diplomatic treaties from this era somehow involving them. And to be fair, they are right in the middle of everything. In fact, the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history is one made between the Hittites and the Egyptians in 1258. And it currently hangs in the wall of the United Nations headquarters. Speaking of the Egyptians, they have one of the largest roles to play in the story we're going to tell. Now, historically speaking, Egypt is a really great place to live. The Nile River slaps as a source of fertility if you want to practice agriculture, and it works really well for fast travel up and down the country. On top of that, the weather is lovely. Bit warm, but generally lovely. Egypt is also the oldest of our states. The Great Pyramids are already 1400 years old. And although they've had a bit of a rocky history recently, the Egyptians in 1200 BCE are the inheritors of an ancient tradition. Egypt in this period is also at the height of its power. The pharaohs of this era, which include such famous names as Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Nefertiti, and Ramses II, ruled over an area that stretched from what is today Sudan all the way up through Egypt to the Levant and then to Syria, where they would clash with the Hittites. And Egypt's rich. Like I said, the Nile River is incredibly fertile, so they have an abundance of food, and so much gold that one Mitanni king once wrote to a pharaoh saying, "In your land, gold is as plentiful as dirt." And they used this gold to trade extensively with the rest of the Bronze Age world. They would import people and goods from the Aegean and Anatolia, and we know this because their inscriptions and artwork include loads and loads of foreigners in Egypt. And all of this was managed by the famous pharaohs, who are some of the most absolute and divine of the great absolute kings of this era. The fighting between the Egyptians and the Hittites probably came to an end on account of the fact that there was a new power in town. Recently, the fairly new kingdom of Assyria had overthrown the Mitanni Empire, and it was knocking on the door of the Hittites' eastern vassals. And the Syrian kings, guided by their great god Ashur, were truly terrifying opponents. And on the periphery of this Bronze Age world, we have other such famous people as the Kassite Babylonians and the Elamites, all inheritors of some of the most continually occupied settled areas on Earth, who still operated huge, wealthy, and powerful kingdoms. So, if we return to our big map here, we see that what we have is a kind of club of great kingdoms and large empires. What seems to have happened is early in the 2nd millennium BCE, the many small autonomous kingdoms and cities started to be absorbed or conquered by their neighbors until we finally have this, them merging into these huge, great states. And in between these great states, we have a few small independent polities. They tend to have their own kings and their own rulers, but they almost always have some kind of fealty or loyalty sworn to one or another of the great kings or great empires. Usually whoever's on top at the time. The cities of Syria are pretty famous for flip-flopping between the Hittites and the Egyptians, according to whichever one of them is the most powerful at that moment. But if you really wanted to enjoy the benefits of the Bronze Age world, you had to get at least a little bit involved in their extensive trade network. And before we really go into that in detail, I'd like to really emphasize the opulence of a lot of these people. Now, when it comes to the Bronze Age, the majority of our evidence is about royalty. So this isn't to suggest that everyone lived an incredibly opulent lifestyle, but it does go to show the levels of wealth and luxury that at least some people had access to. So if we rewind the clock a bit to the 1770s BCE, and we go to the city of Mari in Syria, we find a king called Zimri Lim. And Zimri Lim is incredibly keen to advertise his city as having the first ice house, the first permanent ice house ever built. Now, we don't know for sure that this actually was the first, but it is still amazing to think that a fairly minor king in this era could enjoy ice in his beer, wine, and juice in the summertime. I mean, maybe I'm naive, but the first time I heard about this, I was astounded by it. We usually think of having ice in our drinks during the summer as being a exclusively modern luxury, something we can only do because of electric freezers and things like that. But no, over 3.5 millennia ago, there was a king who enjoyed that very same thing, which is especially remarkable when you think that his kingdom lay in the middle of the fucking desert. Zimri Lim also loved sending luxurious and expensive gifts to his fellow monarchs. For example, he sends a pair of very, very fine Minoan shoes to King Hammurabi of Babylon, and King Hammurabi returns them. Maybe they didn't fit, maybe he just didn't like them, or maybe he felt bad accepting a gift from a man whose city he was about to sack. But either way, Zimri Lim isn't really unique either. The royals of this era loved sending each other gifts. In fact, it was essential to the upkeep of their kingdoms. The exchange of gifts between royals was probably a symbolic gesture to ensure the international trade system kept on going. All of the people of this era were entirely dependent on this trade to get the essential goods that they needed to maintain the lifestyle to which they'd become accustomed. wood, food, gold, oil, bronze. None of these states, not a single one of them, has access to both copper and tin. And this is the Bronze Age. There's no other metal for them to use yet. Now, every state had at least one of these, but none of them had all of them. So rulers spent a lot of time making sure that the flow of goods continued so that they wouldn't be deprived of anything important. The Mycenaeans, who had access to neither copper nor tin, really micromanaged their economy to ensure that nothing could go wrong. In fact, Linear B, their writing system, was developed almost entirely so that they could keep receipts and records of what had and hadn't been exchanged. They would ensure that farmers and artisans made enough of that olive oil and famous Mycenaean pottery that they could go off and trade in Cyprus for metal, in Egypt for food and gold, or in the Levant for wood and dye, and all the other things that they needed to keep the economy moving. This is called a command economy, and it's basically the exact opposite of a free market. The people at the top tell the people at the bottom what to create. They then give it to traders and merchants who take it where it needs to be sent and bring back what they're told to bring back. And all of this is protected by a military class which is usually equipped and paid for by that same centralized government. It works, and it ensures that the essential resources of the Bronze Age get everywhere that they need to go. And this led to that extensive trade network that in turn led to those 2 shipwrecks that were dug up by George Bass. And it was all commanded by this small elite club of great rulers. They squabbled, they got along, they fought, they did diplomacy, and they all did their best not to interrupt the status quo too much. So as well as this exchange of goods and large-scale trade, there was more that kept the Bronze Age world connected. To be a part of this club of great rulers, this club of kings and queens as it were, was to be part of a family. Treaties were never made between states and empires or between different cities. They were made between individuals. So for example, that peace treaty we were talking about between the Hittites and the Egyptians, it wasn't really an agreement between the Hittite people and the Egyptian people. It was a personal pact between Pharaoh Ramses and King Hattusili. The opening line of the Egyptian version of this treaty reads, "Ramses, beloved of Amon, great king, king of Egypt, hero, concluded on a tablet of silver with Hattusili, great king of Hatti, his brother." Now when he says my brother, they're not actually biologically related. This is just an acknowledgement of equality. Rulers who wrote to each other would often call each other siblings, as we can see from this letter from Tushratta of Mitanni to Amenhotep of Egypt. "Tell Nimurea, king of Egypt, my brother, my son-in-law, whom I love and who loves me, Tushratta, king of Mitanni, who loves you, your father-in-law, says, all is well with me. May all be well with you. May all be well with your house, with my daughter, Tadu-Heba, and with your wife, whom you love. May all be very well with your wives, your sons, your leading men, your chariots, your horses, your troops, your country, and whatever else belongs to you." And if they weren't equals, the language would reflect that. So when a Syrian vassal of the Hittite king writes to him, he refers to him as his father, even though again, they are definitely not biologically related. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." Evidently, this guy is appealing to his liege lord for help against some kind of enemy that's rocked up. And he's explained that he can't deal with the situation on his own, because his troops are away fighting in that very same liege lord's own wars. Hopefully they resolve all of this though, so let's see what happens next. Ah yes, the nearby city of Carchemish has replied, saying that they'll send reinforcements. The next letter from Ugarit is probably one saying that it all worked out. "When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it." Oh, that doesn't sound good. Wonder how long it takes for poor Ugarit to recover. Oh, never. Okay. So all of these states we've gone over, all of these great kingdoms, this fantastic civilization, and this system of trade that allowed people to access goods from thousands of miles away, disappeared in the 12th century. The great palaces of the Mycenaeans, gone. The cities of the Hittites, also gone, completely burned down. They as a civilization are just lost. They go unmentioned by history other than a context-free cameo in the Bible until their cities are finally dug up again in the 19th century. By the way, shout out to my boy Uriah the Hittite. On the island of Cyprus, the locals bury their valuables in safe caches underground and then evacuate the island, hoping to return and collect it all again when times get better. But times never get better, and the people never come back for any of their possessions. Egypt survives, though much diminished. The empire loses control of all of its overseas territories, and soon the smaller states that had forever lived in Egypt's shadow started to scavenge its corpse. A mortal blow is never really struck to the Egyptians, but this is kind of the end of ancient Egypt as we know it. This is the end of the New Kingdom, and the beginning of what Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, an era of decline from which the country never recovers. No pharaoh will ever wield the same power that Ramses II did ever again. The Assyrians, the people who had put the fear of God into the other great kings, also survive, but again, much diminished. They withdraw from their large empire holding, and for a little while just survive on the edge of the Zagros Mountains. And those who are near them, like the Kassite Babylonians, also fall into an era of chaos. The whole of Mesopotamia loses stability. This is called the Bronze Age collapse, and it's one of the most abrupt endings to civilization in all of history. Usually when things kind of fall out of the historical narrative, they do so gradually. Rome's empire fell so slowly that historians have a margin of error of basically 1,000 years of debate to when it actually ended. The same is true of feudalism. And when things do end very, very abruptly, like for example the Japanese shogunate, it's usually because of one huge reality-altering event. The Bronze Age collapse is so much bigger though, because it wasn't just the end of one or two of these kingdoms, it was the end of the entire thing. And they took with them a great deal of their knowledge. Writing is lost in Greece as the region slips into what historians call the Dark Age. And when I say writing is lost, I don't just mean it becomes rarer or it stops being practiced for a few generations. Linear B, the writing system, completely goes, and when the Greeks come up with a new alphabet many centuries later, it is not related to the original one. They started from scratch, basically. Those giant palatial centers for which the Mycenaeans were so famous, those also go away, and they don't come back. Many, many centuries later, the classical Greeks will call them Cyclopean, because they explain such huge structures existing as being built by cyclopses, because nothing new in their day is made like that anymore. But the abandoned palaces and the obsolete writing system are just the corpse of the Bronze Age. The actual death of it refers to the loss of two things. First of all, that great king's club, those large empires that were very, very centralized with governments headed around a royal family, those disappear and become smaller autonomous states. And the other is the trade system. The extensive trade network that those two shipwrecks were evidence of, and that brought those luxury goods from all over the Bronze Age world to all the different parts of it. The thing that kept all these states going by making sure that everyone had access to all the resources they needed, that disappears as well. And this raises the obvious question, how is it that these people, as advanced and intelligent as they clearly were, couldn't keep it all? How did they lose everything? And they didn't lose it gradually like the Romans did. They lost it over the course of 1 or 2 generations. Well, that's the thing. Nobody knows. It's one of history's greatest and most famous mysteries, and it's the one that I plan on tackling over a course of several videos that I'm going to release over the next few weeks. Was it the invasions of the Sea Peoples? Was it internal rebellion? Some change in the social class structure? Natural disaster, or climate change, or famine, or plague? Well, these are the questions that have perplexed historians and archaeologists for decades now. And now I, a totally unqualified enthusiast who has done some of the reading, am going to find the conclusion. I'm going to dig through all of the evidence. I'm going to look up the meaning of long words. And I'm going to use facts and logic to deduce once and for all what the cause of the Great Bronze Age collapse actually was. Sure, there's not really a great deal of evidence for this era, and sure, the evidence that we do have isn't very good, but I'm confident that within a few weeks, I'm going to have a conclusion for you guys.
So who was Uriah the Hittite?
Uriah the Hittite, he's basically my favourite side character from the Old Testament. He was a soldier of King David's, but King David really wanted to bang his wife, so King David sent him to the front lines of war in the hopes that he'd get killed, which he does, and then David has his way with his wife and God gets very angry. It's a whole thing.
Sounds like good friends.
Yeah, I mean, they were good friends, but King David wasn't a particularly good guy, if that makes sense, you know?
Could make a good video at least.
Yeah, I thought that, but the one I've just done is already pretty long. It's a Goliath of a video, if you will. I'll probably just put this in the outro whilst I recommend people the rest of my content and try and convince them to subscribe and stuff.